Today, we are delighted to have J. Lee Annis Jr. to discuss his new biography from the University Press of Mississippi, Big Jim Eastland, The Godfather of Mississippi. Joseph Crespino, author of In Search of Another Country, Mississippi and the Conservative Counter-Revolution, wrote of the book, James Eastland was one of the most influential and enigmatic figures in 20th century Southern politics. Lee Annis's deeply researched book sheds important light not only on Eastland himself, but also on the history of civil rights conflict, Cold War politics, and the U.S. Senate. Lee Annis lives in Silver Spring, Maryland. He has taught history at Montgomery College for the past 30 years. He is the author of Howard Baker, Conciliator in an Age of Crisis, and with Senator William H. Frist, the co-author of Tennessee Senators 1911 to 2001, Portraits of Leadership in the Century of Change. He's chair of the History and Political Science Department at the Rockville campus of Montgomery College. Help me welcome. Let you get through. Help me welcome Lee Annis.
First of all, let me thank a couple of people who've been very helpful. Congressman David Bowen, who has some of the best stories around, and I would encourage him to write about some of them. And also Mr. Albert Hilliard, who has a very helpful biography of Fielding Wright, which was very helpful. I think that's the only thing that's ever been written about Fielding Wright, the actual vice presidential nominee on the Dixiecrat Party, but very much worth reading. And people would want to know, I suppose, here, how did anybody who's half Yankee want to write about James Eastland? Well, I have written about Tennessee a lot, and as I was doing an update on my biography of Senator Howard Baker, I was driving through Mississippi, and I was thinking about which Southern senators at the time had not had a good biography. If anybody's in here, I'd still say there's not a good one of John McClellan, not a good one of John Sparkman, and not a good enough one of John Stennis that I'd encourage anybody to take a look at and to try and write something about sometime. But actually, Eastland was someone I'd read about, and I started just reading general stuff. I found that this guy is not just a mentor to Jesse Helms and Orrin Hatch, conservatives of a different party. But as you start looking more, he's a mentor to Gaylord Nelson, who is the founder of Earth Day, and a mentor to Senator Ted Kennedy, which doesn't seem normal. The sad thing is that doesn't happen today. And then there's one more clincher to this particular tale. I had a professor in the 1970s in grad school, my mentor. He would regale his classes with a story of him as a young man of 18 coming home from Yale. And he stopped in Washington for Thanksgiving. And he got set up with a girl he described as the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen. And he was a liberal. And he said, like any Southerners at the time, they started talking about race. About 5 minutes into the conversation. And about 10 minutes later, he says, you know, I can't agree with you. And another 5 minutes, he says, you know, that Strom Thurmond is a piece of work. Lester Hill of Alabama is even worse, but the biggest is James O. Eastland of Mississippi. And supposedly it was at that time when he found out that that was Eastland's daughter. Now, supposedly, well, supposedly, what I have met with all of the Eastland kids together, and supposedly they didn't remember it. So what this book may be a result of is a fraternity prank on Ned. At any rate, that was the clincher on it. So I decided here's a story to be told. There is more to it than the sex business that we've read about for so many years. Roger Mudd told me that James Eastland had the worst press of anyone in Washington. And he didn't care. He had some people who were able press secretaries. Larry Speakes was later the press secretary for Ronald Reagan, an assistant under Gerald Ford. He didn't try to get a story out, but around town, and certainly you'll find in my book, you're going to find the stories of the civil rights battles being fought on the negative side. They had a pretty good idea they were going to lose. And some things that did happen that shouldn't have happened. Eastland did speak about some, I think the worst thing I can find that he ever charged African Americans with was, or Africans of doing, he said that there was a rash of rapes of French women in 1945. The fact of the matter is that there weren't any Africans in that particular part of France. That the Africans who were there were Arab Africans. But you will find all the descriptions of the civil rights bills from 1957 to 1960, to 1964, 65, and 68. If you want to look at any pattern, what can I say that somebody else may not have? I think he was probably more loud. He was certainly louder in fighting civil rights in election years than in non-election years. 1954 is the year of Brown, but that was the year he had his toughest primary. And that was also the year, he did have his opponent, Carroll Garton, who was a moderate Mississippian, did try to get to his right on segregation, and maybe it wasn't pretty, but certainly here is a guy who was as much in the forefront of segregation as anyone. Was he that dangerous of a person? I don't think so. Certainly he was a man of his time who did believe in what he called at the time white supremacy. He did change in part because of the necessity after 1965. Some note that he changed even before, but always with his own staff, his own, the people who worked for him on the plantation. He could be quite generous. He did build a black church where people worshiped at. There was one of the ones who was closest to him. He gave a Thunderbird, and he bought cigars from time to time. And some of those who stayed, I don't know if they got the good ones he smoked, but nevertheless, he did give some to the people who worked for him. So maybe the best word for him, and maybe the one I hear you see a lot here, the Governor Winter would say, he would agree with me when I use the word paternalist. One of my deans is an African American who's a little bit younger than I am. I'm not going to date him, but he says, you know, we can tell the difference between Ross Barnett and James Eastland. And there was Eastland, if you went to him quietly, if you're white or black, if you hadn't gone after him, I think he would try to help you out. And the one thing I will tell you, when I researched this book, when I went to people who had been on the staffs of the president or their colleagues, every one of them would say, this is a guy who helped us out. Great American, from people I didn't understand, I didn't believe would say this. The Kennedy administration, you know, they worked with him. They were told, some people said, you can work with Eastland, you cannot work with Ross Barnett. The Kennedy administration found that out in a couple of cases. I think you all know the stories better than I do. But in the case of the Freedom Riders, John Siegenthaler was one I got to talk to before he died, one of the best newspaper men I ever met. John Siegenthaler was knocked cold by a lead pipe in Montgomery, Alabama. So he wasn't around, but nevertheless he could relay the story of how there was a deal cut in Mississippi with Governor Coleman and ex-Governor Coleman at the time, and James Eastland, whereby the Freedom Riders would proceed here to Jackson. The guard there on the bus was Sonny Montgomery, who was, before he was a congressman, and they would go to Jackson. Now the Freedom Riders were not told that they would not be hurt, but they were arrested and they stayed in Parchment for a couple of months, but they were not touched, and that was part of the agreement, and it was kept by James Eastland. And you don't know, and here was a man of his word in 1962, the Battle of Oxford, know, one thing we like to do as historians, we like to dismantle myths. If you've read Nicholas Katzenbach's book, his autobiography, the funny story is supposedly that Eastland was watching President Kennedy speak on the night of the Battle of Oxford, and the segregationists got upset and kicked him the TV tube. And I presented the draft to someone in the know, and I got a call back from Sue Eastland, who wasn't home that night. The senator was in D.C. I think this may have been one of the things that may have helped me find. There was a master's thesis on John Bell Williams, and certainly what the story was, though, was that Eastland was in Washington. For 3 hours, Eastland, John Stennis, and the rest of the Mississippi congressional delegation were trying to reach Ross Barnett. And you think, guys, that powerful in D.C., I'd call back in a minute. They didn't. And so you are maybe certainly people learned they could rely upon that. Publicly, Eastland would commend Barnett, but privately, I think that people were saying this is not someone we should be dealing with. Certainly, in the case of Lyndon Johnson, Bobby Baker found that Lyndon Johnson could rely upon him, not on civil rights, but they could rely upon Eastland's word. They were close friends. Richard Nixon, not buddies at first. Former colleagues. Eastland was always somewhat deferential to the president. He got a lecture from Franklin D. Roosevelt, and FDR would say when he first became a senator, look, we're good Democrats. But if you want something, give me a call and tell me what you need. We'll take 2 minutes, and then I'll tell you what I want. and you're going to listen for 15 minutes. Now, it never turned out that FDR needed his vote. But in the case of Richard Nixon, the trouble that some of you may remember had to do with Camille. And that mess was cleaned up. It wasn't just Richard Nixon. It was James Eastland. It was a liberal Democrat like Birch Bayh. Birch Bayh had experienced something in Indiana where 150 people were killed in the vicinity of South Bend in 1965. So these guys worked together. And there's a relationship forged with Eastland, and some other Southerners weren't comfortable with George McGovern. Privately, they would side with Nixon. Now, there's another story. I can tell a peachy story here. Yeah, there's George McGovern had made one comment. Eastland went up to George McGovern and said, George, did you really tell that demonstrator kiss your way? And McGovern was sheepish. He said, a war hero. He was a modest man. McGovern, yeah, kid. That's the best line of the campaign. So there's a good relationship with virtually people on every side in that particular time. Joe Ford, I think people would tell you, he's a great American, although there is no close relationship. Eastland went back to the Democratic Party in 1976. He was loyal to Jimmy Carter. And I can tell you, when I went to the Carter Congressional Liaison guy, those guys returned my calls quickly, which you wouldn't expect to see. Eastland was very helpful, and people like Jim Free of Tennessee would go into Doddsville, and they'd talk to Eastland, and Eastland would say, have you talked to Democratic Politico A, B, C, and D? And if the answer was no to any of the 4 or 8 or 12 or whatever it was that day, you would see a puff of a cigar and a stare. And Jim Free and Dan Tate would tell you they don't ever want to see that look again. But certainly you're going to find a guy who was very instrumental to Jimmy Carter here. Jimmy Carter would win Mississippi by 7,000 votes in 1976. And they were always grateful somehow the Tennessee Tom Digby waterway, which Carter had previously called wasteful, got built. And got completed. The vote came in 1977. That was something that would pay off. So I would tell you that when I talk to people like him or senators Senators really admired him, and I think with all the one exception who didn't know him well, and that this person was of a different party and critical of his image. The others, the Democrats would say he's very helpful. Now, maybe one little thing I'll also give you is a story about, the stories about what I call the encounter. One of my colleagues does a lecture on the encounter between Native Americans and white people when we first arrived. And so I'll do this. The encounter for Jim Eastland is when he's chairman of the committee and senators come in to get their committee assignments. And some of the folks who went on the Judiciary Committee were pretty liberal, and they're happy to pass on the tail. And the encounter means you go in and get your committee assignments, and the first thing you hear is, what are you drinking? Scotch or bourbon at 9:30 in the morning. And a couple of them would tell them and have a drink and just to be cordial. One of them who I got to was Orrin Hatch. If you've seen Orrin Hatch, you know he's a guy who is what you see on TV, a devout Mormon who writes hymns for a sidelight. But when he hears Scotch or bourbon, Hatch's response is, Mr. Chairman, my Mormon faith dictates that I abstain from alcoholic beverages. And Eastland's response is, what the hell kind of church is that? The other one is Ted Kennedy. Now, Ted Kennedy at that time had not developed a habit or problem or anything that you would be aware of. He's the president's brother, so he's a little bit worried about his image. And Eastland would give him a couple of pieces of advice. One, our friend Jerry Nash told me that was the best piece of advice he ever got was never put things in writing. If you want something, you come to me. Maybe it's the same advice he got from Franklin D. Roosevelt. And I think he only sent him one letter, and I assume that letter was that Eastland knew was coming, but I only found one in the archives, and he kept to that word. He says, you're going to have to do your work. You may want to be president, but you're going to have more fun if people appreciate you around here. And so I think whether we like Ted Kennedy or not, you have to admire that he wasn't the best senator in the family compared to Bobby or JFK. I think the two others, I may say that they were in the Senate to become president. In the case of Teddy, though, Teddy probably was somewhat mystified by his brothers and maybe did enjoy being in the Senate. He did apply himself like the brothers did not, and I think he probably had a better time. I started research after Ted Kennedy, unfortunately, began his bout with brain cancer. So I didn't get to see him, but certainly his people had open doors. But when the encounter that day came, when Ted Kennedy came in, he got some of the best advice he ever got, and then he said Ted Kennedy was ready. He wanted to get on the Immigration Committee. He wanted to get on the Constitution Committee and the Civil Rights Subcommittee. That's probably three choice committees, and he doesn't talk much, he listens. Eastland says, I hear you Kennedys have a lot of Italians up there in Massachusetts. Have a drink there. Have a drink there, finish that drink, and I'll put you on the Immigration Committee. And so Kennedy drinks his stuff. One other thing about the drinks that Eastland would give you, and this only came out, Larry Speaks told Al Haig later on. Eastland would give anybody coming in his office at work time, rather than after 5, a glass that was large. It was about 90% full of Chivas Regal, this big. He would have a small glass. So that would allow him to keep control of things who weren't on people who weren't wise to him. But in the case of Ted Kennedy, he would say, after that, he says, well, there's another thing you Kennedys are always talking about, Constitution. Have another drink, and I'll put you on the Constitution Subcommittee. And he does, and Kennedy starts to feel a little bit buzzed. And the first chance that he gets, that Eastland looks around, turns his back, Ted Kennedy finds a plant. And dumps that in. He says, well, one more. You Kennedys are always interested in civil rights. So have another drink, and you go on the Civil Rights Subcommittee. And Ted Kennedy would write in his memoirs and in other places that He did weave back to his office. And he had to worry about that. It isn't just Ted Kennedy's political career he's worried about at the time. His brother's the president. But maybe here is Ted Kennedy's first drink that he ever had. Eastland, I think, in Mississippi, you all would recognize, was the defender of cotton. And in the 1950s and 60s, there was a pretty well understood matter on the Agriculture Committee that you represent an industry. And one thing I think I can tell you is that a lot of the Chef's Regal was paid for by the Cotton Council. I heard that from on the Eastland staff and from outside, from friends and foes. So they did help out, but it was understood that you represented an industry, and Sam Irvin's great line about this was, I could understand, Sam Irvin, of course, represented the tobacco industry, being from North Carolina. He says, my feeling was about wheat. It has everything to do with how Milton Young of North Dakota thinks about tobacco. And so Eastland would follow that with cotton, and you are going, maybe cotton is going to change. Eastland actually in 1941 came to town. He was appointed to the Senate in 1941. And one of the things he got was limits on cottonseed prices lifted by the OPA more quietly. And got a couple of other little bills through. Usually when you're in there for a couple of months, nothing gets done. You vote. You go along with your leadership. Eastland got something done so he could go back in 1942. Now, some people say he was elected because he was a segregationist. I don't think that's true. I think he was elected. Anybody who would have been elected for Mississippi would have been a segregationist. That was the way the state felt, and that was then with African Americans not allowed to vote. That was the case. Eastland was elected because he served constituents. There are some amazing tales you can hear about him getting things done. Let me give you one of a cotton farmer who couldn't sell his cotton in the late 60s. He takes his cotton over to South Carolina. He says, I can't sell it. He calls Courtney Pace, who was Eastland's top aide for 36 years and 88 days. And a strange tale, 2 weeks after Jim Eastland leaves the Senate, Courtney Pace died. But here's a man who's devoted. They served together in the legislature. Pace gets a call at 10 o'clock from this farmer. And he says, I can't sell my cotton. He says, well, I'll call Eastland. And Eastland calls the farmer at 10:45 at night. And he says, what you want? And he says, I need to sell my cotton. I can't sell it. I'm going broke. Eastland says, I haven't been able to sell my cotton this year. So he says, let me see what I can do. The next morning, at 7:45 in the morning, the farmer gets a call. He says, Factor X will meet you at 10 o'clock at this place. Don't be late. And when the farmer got to the factory, he heard that not only had Jim Eastland called, but John Stennis and Sonny Montgomery called as well. And the farmer would say the factory told him, he says, I've heard of stuff like this happening. But the next thing I expected to hear was from Lyndon Johnson himself. And things like that happened quite a bit. I guess another story Bill Miner told me, the great reporter for the New Orleans paper. And there's a couple of versions to this tale. A man named Leander Perez, a segregationist, a friend of Eastland, more from cattle sales than anything else, had been excommunicated by the Catholic Church. His dying wishes, he wanted to be buried next to his wife in a Catholic cemetery in New Orleans. And Eastland says, oh, it's a dying wish, it ain't going to hurt anything. So he goes to the church, and they're not interested in changing their excommunication. So, what else can he do when he finds out in D.C. that the Catholics, there's two versions of this. One is that there are more than $100,000 in unpaid parking tickets by the priests. And the second version is that there are a lot of priests who've overstayed their visas. And whichever one is true, that threat was laid in a rather certain way, and they understood, and Jim Eastland is going to we'll see to it that Leander Perez does live in consecrated ground now in New Orleans. So here's a guy who I think is the reason he's elected is in a way that may not, is far different from today's TV age. He's not a guy who goes on TV. I think that when I look between 1957 and 1978, I don't know of one of what Trump calls the shows where Jim Eastland ever appeared. We expect that these days from our politicians. We expect TV politicians. Trent Lott told me that Eastland had 3 guys in every county. One was the richest guy in the town to be his finance chairman in the county. The second would be one person who's close to the people. In Jackson County, it was a barber. And the third guy was just someone who was a county supervisor. And these 3 guys would tell him what was going on, generally in short, and people who could communicate a message in very short sentences. And he would get his message and he'd have a pretty good instinct. But here's a man who was a servant for what the electorate in Mississippi wanted at the time, unfortunately for Mississippi. At the time, that was all white, or 94% white. Now, strangely enough, things changed with the Voting Rights Act. And Eastland was an opponent, but at the time of his departure from the Senate, you would find that the 5 best-known African Americans in Mississippi were friends or supporters. And see, the first one was Walter Payton. And of course, a couple of aides, we heard about this a little bit last night, but a couple of aides got to know Walter Payton and waited tables while at Jackson State, but Eastland had taken to the Touchdown Club as his guest, and Payton was one who called in 1978 to ask that he run again. James Merritt is another. And in the case of James Merritt, I don't know how close, but I think he still calls himself a friend. We hire Eastland, make sure he's with James Eastland all the time. They have a film coming out, which I would encourage, which is about to be made. Another is Charles Evers, and certainly they're friends. And the most important would be Aaron Henry. And Aaron Henry is one guy who I think Evers would tell me he probably worked as close as much for reconciliation amongst the races as anyone. And they start out as something of enemies. And there are tales about Aaron Henry being bisexual. The story was at first that Aaron Henry would greet people in ways that even he would rub noses with a lot of people, would scare folks. And Eastland knew when Aaron Henry was coming to do business, and so what he'd do is he'd put 35 chairs around the table, so that when Eastland came up to hug or to rub noses together, that couldn't happen. They'd have to shake hands. But as time went on, they got to be very close friends. And so Henry would take some criticism when we went to a dinner in Jackson in 1976 honoring Eastland. He will find that Eastland can bring home money like no other person can. And Eastland is going to finally, Henry says he's going to have to see some other progress in Eastland in 1977, 78, when people think he might run again. We'll speak at Russ College to that body. We'll see to it that Ted Kennedy comes in, but finally he appoints a man named Ed Cole to his office and staff in Washington, and that, Aaron Henry says, is what I need, and he endorses James Eastland. And he didn't run again, but he was ready to go all out for someone who's been a segregationist. The other story, the other of the 5, is Speaker Robert Clark. He was the first African-American speaker, first member of the Mississippi House. And Clark had an interesting tale as well. And certainly they weren't close. They can't call him a friend like you can call the others, but Robert Clark had a problem with a bureaucrat. The bureaucrat was supposed to be helping him getting out. In Lexington, a youth center open. And he called Eastland and said, "What can I do?" He says, "Where are you?" He says, "I'm at the Holiday Inn in Jackson." And Eastland says, "Stay there." And about 15 minutes later, Speaker Clark gets a call. And it's a bureaucrat who'd been giving him a run around for 2 months. And he never found out what Eastland did, but he sure was appreciative. And so you find stories like that. Again, this is a man who operates something of a patron-client relationship with his constituents. At the end of his term, you find that Eastland has begun to take African Americans into his clientele and doing it with relish and certainly skillfully. And again, as long as you didn't make an attack on him, I think that would be, so I think he'd be willing to do just about anything for you. Now, I think one of the things as well we can say about James Eastland, a question came up yesterday about if somebody asked what he would think of his prime contribution. He'd probably say that the Supreme Court was a bit more conservative after he became chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, another role here. Certainly Eastland was harder on the judges of President Eisenhower than he was on the Democrats or Richard Nixon. But certainly everyone that Kennedy put up. He opposed Thurgood Marshall, but quietly. In the Kennedy administration, or in the Johnson administration, he opposed Abe Fortas's elevation to the Chief Justiceship. He said, told Lyndon Johnson privately that it would tear the country apart. There's some interesting tales I'm not going to get into here necessarily, but he would share that. With the Nixon judges, though, Nixon and Eastland did want to see a more conservative court than the liberal band under Earl Warren. There was one terribly bad judge Nixon put up that Eastland took it as a duty to support him, a guy named G. Harold Carswell. And I think that senators like Marlowe Cook of Kentucky, who had supported previous efforts, Marlowe Cook would say that this guy isn't fit to have law degree. He doesn't belong on the court. And Eastland would tell the Nixon people, look, this guy's his own worst enemy. Now, privately, publicly say this is a Southerner, and we got to support him, but when people came to him and said, we have real complaints about this guy's intellect as well as integrity. He had been a segregationist who continued to belong to all white clubs. But certainly he had been rude to civil rights attorneys, and when people came to him, Eastland will let it slide. You've got a point there, raise it. You have your right to raise it. I'm not going to interfere with that. And he would give the Nixon administration the intelligence to go forward. Now, there were two other judges. Eastland will be the guy who tells Nixon to send Justice Powell and Justice Kleindienst as Justice Rehnquist as a package. That's the way you're going to confirm them. Eastland was more supportive of the more conservative of the two, William Rehnquist. They'd work together, and later on Eastland would go to go over to Rehnquist's office on the Supreme Court. It's a walk about a quarter mile. This is his exercise for the day. He'd go over to Rehnquist's office and he'd say, get a haircut, and then walk out. But he would go into, he invited Lewis Powell to lunch, and he said, you know, you're going to be confirmed. And Powell wasn't so sure as a Southerner. A couple of Southerners had been rejected before. G. Harold Carswell, but before that, Clement Haynesworth, who was a lot more qualified Southerner, who was defeated for conflict of interest issues. Some of the labor unions thought he'd be anti-civil rights. As it turned out, he never ruled in a federal case against the civil rights litigant against an African-American litigant. So maybe people were wrong about Haynesworth. In the case of Powell, Powell's afraid because of what he had managed. He had been one of the lawyers for Clement Haynesworth. And Eastland will look at him and invite him to lunch, and he says, you know, you're going to be confirmed. Powell was worried. He's 64, but looks a lot older. He says, why do you think I'm going to be confirmed? It didn't happen to my friend Clarence Ainsworth. Eastland waits for about a half a minute. He says, because they think they're going to die. So I think you're going to find here Eastland will work now. And certainly Mississippi hasn't had many people in the Senate, Trent Level, anyone, in 80 years now. Since 1947, you've had 5 men in the Senate. Eastland, John Stennis, Thad Cochran, Trent Lyon, Roger Wicker. That's it, just 5. But that doesn't sound like you guys keep reelecting people. They bring home a lot of money. Walter Mondale would joke that they brought Mississippi home. Mississippi had an agreement with the rest of the country. Eastland and Stennis said the rest of the country gets 50%, Mississippi gets 50% of the funds coming. This is the most stable relationship until Strom Thurmond and Ernest Holling served together for 36 years, a few years after, and it's one there which was mutually supportive. I think did bring Mississippi a lot of benefits. And the story I'll leave you with is one that they tell commonly in Washington about the two and the relationship. And Stennis is quite a different guy. He's one of the founders of the Congressional Prayer Breakfast, very religious, a lot more intellectual. He can speak about anything intelligent. And Eastland is a guy who grunts a bit. He doesn't use any more words to make a point than he needs. He puffs constantly on that cigar. Often Havana cigar. He'd go to Ted Kennedy very often and give him one of his cigars rather than the little ones. And he'd have an aide say, tell Senator Kennedy to start smoking a man's. They're indicated, but they're two different kind of guys, and the supposedly group constituents went to Washington, and Stennis took them all to lunch. Gave them a speech on whatever they wanted to hear about for about an hour. They all were moved and were ready to vote for John Stennis again. They loved him. And then they went over to Eastland for about 10 minutes. He smoked a cigar the whole way, blew smoke in the air, grunted a little bit, didn't speak much of anything, had his feet on the desk. And the group said, well, how'd you like the two? And they said, well, John Stennis is great. He's a fine man, he's bright. He listens to every one of us, but Big Jim is our kind of guy. And so, but I think that one of the things that's fair to say is that Stennis was, somebody told us last night, Stennis was supposedly the master of the Senate. And Jim Eastland was the Godfather of Mississippi. And that's the title I use. I cribbed that one from one of your members of Congress. But anyway, I'll take questions now.
That was an interesting list of African Americans that supported Eastland. Missing from that list is someone from the area, Senator Taylor. What was their relationship with them?
I don't know that they ever met. Woods Eastland told me a while back that he used to work with Hap Haney, her husband, and he knew him. I don't know that Eastland ever, I don't think they ever met. From what I know, I think Chris Ashe in his book, The Senator and the Sharecropper, is a different kind of book than mine, would juxtapose the two, but I don't know that she may have had friends on Eastland's plantation. But I just don't think the two ever met, even though, we were driving that road about just yesterday, and Fannie Lou Hamer is buried about 10 miles away from the plantation. Yeah, but I don't believe they ever met. And certainly they're on opposite sides of the 1964 convention. Eastland was not there, but that's...
She gave her address and said it was the same area which Eastland lived, and of course Johnson cut her off, but that's something else again.
Yeah. But yeah, that's a good question.
You also wrote about Howard Baker, Everett Dirkson's son-in-law.
Yes.
What was his relationship with Jim Eastland?
Howard Baker, he looked up, Dirkson, and that's a good story that just opened me up to. Dirkson had a good relationship with Eastland. We both voted a conservative line. And Dirkson in 1954, and Jim Eastland would do some of this as well. Courtney Page went up to Dirkson and said, could you condemn Jim Eastland? And Dirkson was representative of the land of Lincoln, prided himself on being, when he was in Congress, representing the area that Lincoln once lived in. And Dirkson wrote a condemnation. He says the biggest obstruction in the Senate. And that was, they made sure the press got that to Mississippi, because that would help Eastland. He wasn't so certain. They were colleagues on the judiciary, and it worked out. Certainly, I think that was an image that Eastland liked to say, you know, he killed 127 bills, and he says, I have all these pockets where I can stuff bills and so on. But that was the image that Eastland wanted. Howard Baker, in the last conversation I ever had with him, was in 2011. And Howard Baker said that he was one who called Eastland Mr. Jim. Now, there were different generations. Eastland born in 1904, Baker in 1925, Baker a veteran. Eastland wasn't, but I guess the first thing that Baker would say, the first recollection he had was of any contact was when he got a note asking for a discussion about Tennessee Tom Bigby. And Baker said, that sounds great, I'll be glad to support it. And he later was convinced it was a good project, he was happy to have done it. But that was only after, but he said it was at that time that it was, you know, not too long thereafter when he recognized there wasn't even a spoonful of water in Tennessee, in that Tennessee Tom Bigby project. Baker was briefly on the Senate Judiciary Committee for the purpose of blocking the elevation of Abe Fortas, the Chief Justice. He went on later to be on the Commerce Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee, and that's and Public Works Committee, committees which more directly affected Tennessee. He was one who respected Eastland, the two-headed, but at the same time, I guess that one story that Baker told me as well is Baker comes from a town of not bigger than Doddsville. They both lived in a county called Scott County. Eastland once lived in Forest, Mississippi, Scott County. Baker lived in Huntsville, in Tennessee, a town of about 500. But there aren't many, there's only a couple of motels in town, and Eastland was looking at this as some coal and oil interests in the next town over, Oneida. And so Eastland, he said, Baker would say that Eastland spent the night reading his Civil War books and detective stories, which is what he read. And sipping on the Chevis Regal, and he heard that from the clerks. You hear about that in small towns. And Baker would say, I heard you were in town, why didn't you call me? And Eastland would say, I didn't need you for anything. I think Eastland would direct Senator Baker to D.A. Big Lane, someone he should get to know, someone who could be helpful on oil issues. He would direct him to, in ways the two could relate. Baker had a mild interest in the Civil War, being from the Republican or Union side of Tennessee. He and Eastland aren't going to agree on that either. But he would direct him, I think that he talked to Eastland before he came to Vicksburg. Before he came to Vicksburg, he toured the battlefield on one occasion. But Baker would point out that Everett Dirkson's relationship was fairly close. But his was that of a man of one generation, talking to a man of an older generation.
You talked a lot about the collegiality of people during Eastland's time in the Senate. It seems like the relationships now are very adversarial.
Right.
How did that happen, and what do you think could make it change?
Two best lines I've heard. Eastland, Eastland children will tell you that what started the shift downward was that people, the kids didn't get to know each other. So people, and I know, and it's gone downhill. I know that some friendships were formed. It's just in the first press I did business with, the publisher was friends with Bill Frist as well as Ted Kennedy, because their kids all went to St. Albans, the Episcopal school in D.C. And their kids went to the same schools. That's a common interest. You cheer for the same teams. You help the kids with their homework. They get to know each other. The best line I heard from a source here was from a lobbyist who worked in the Nixon and Ford administration. People stopped drinking together. And I can find sources in the Ford library that indicated that there were a group of people meeting together, including Jim Eastland, Roman Ruska, a conservative Republican from Nebraska, John Pastore, a liberal from Rhode Island, and Walter Mondale, who was another one. And there was a crew that met in the Secretary of the Senate's office. The Secretary of the Senate was a guy named Kemet who worked for Mike Mansfield, was his ultimate boss, the Senate Majority Leader. And his line was, he would tell you that more business got done in that convivial setting than was done on the Senate floor or in any of the committees. And his line was, the road to hell started when people and senators stopped drinking together. Now, you can blame a lot of other things. If you talk about the House of Representatives, gerrymandering certainly is hurt things. And as a lot of members of the House move up to the Senate, those bad relationships continue in the Senate. Certainly, all the 24/7 talk show business on cable TV. And I think people can blame each other, maybe talk radio, where you find people struggle to be more outlandish than their competitor hasn't helped anything. But I think things have changed. One line I get, one of the best lines I got from Bobby Baker's, it's the biggest bunch of idiots I've ever seen. Bobby Baker was supposedly the 97th senator in the 1950s. And I mentioned that to one of my sources who's a fairly conservative Republican. I don't know if he wants to be outed, who's out. But he said, Bobby Baker's right. And it is a mess. I do think that things need to change. And it was a better Senate. People got things done. If you want to look at a book, the details of plight of the Senate when things went better. Ira Shapiro is a guy who wrote The Last Great Senate about 5 years ago. He speaks about the Senate under President Carter when some things did get done in a better way than they have since.
The comments you made about the fellow that asked him why he didn't call him and he said because I didn't need you,
Yeah.
would seem to be kind of his career in so many ways, in that you may be able to list 4 or 5 African American friends, and I would put that in quotes, and he needed some help from them. He saw voting rights coming on. He must have been able to predict the future, and I think ultimately he did when he decided not to run again. But, and correct me where I go wrong, but it seemed like he had a few black friends. He didn't like being hugged or kissed by Aaron Henry, I understand.
Right.
It just seems like, even if you go back to his early time in the Senate, he was much more concerned about bales of cotton and how to sell it than he was about the condition of so many people in the state, particularly the Delta. And I don't think there's any way that he could be described as a supporter of civil rights.
No, you're absolutely right there. Certainly he was a segregationist. He was a man of his time. The great line of picking up, you're absolutely right. Not a supporter of civil rights. He was one who did see change, and if you don't adapt to change, you're going to get defeated. I think his people would tell you that, and he did understand that. The great line I've heard Ted Kennedy use when he heard about Aaron Henry Kissingham once in 1978 was, you know, there are two things I'd like to see. One is Aaron Henry kissing Ted Kennedy, or Aaron Henry kissing Jim Eastland. Second is Jim Eastland when he found out that the newspapers had a picture of Aaron Henry kissing Jim Eastland. Yeah.
What about Joseph McCarthy? What was his relationship there?
McCarthy had a drinking problem. And as far as personal ties, they weren't close. J. Edgar Hoover, when he did business, he went to Eastland and Pat McCarran's predecessor, Chairman of the Senate, the Security Subcommittee, because they were responsible enough to keep their mouths shut about pending investigations. And so the investigation won't be broken about by someone with a loose throat spreading all kind of nonsense about people who aren't guilty. And in the case of McCarthy, Eastland, John Stennis was on the committee that investigating McCarthy, and Stennis voted to censure Joe McCarthy. Eastland went along with that. Now, later in 1955 and 1956, McCarthy started drinking a little bit more. Eastland was one who saw him as a victim by that time of the press, which had gone amok. And I think that's, McCarthy couldn't control himself by that time, but Eastland was one who thought that the press had done him in. On a personal level, the closest friends that Eastland had were, and your discussion is of friends in quotes, these are the real friends, the closest friends that Eastland had were Roman Ruska and John Pastore. On a personal level, Everett Dirksen was one who was somewhat close. Hubert Humphrey had a good relationship with Lyndon Johnson, had a good relationship with, were they bosom buddies? I don't know that would be the case, but McCarthy didn't fit that category. And then a working relationship, John Stennis and Eastland talked 2 or 3 times a day. They told each other how they were going to vote. Eastland and Theodore Bilbo didn't speak for 5 years in the Senate. They just didn't. There was a rivalry there, and going into that a little bit, you can see Eastland telling Bilbo. Bilbo suggested that Eastland volunteer for the service rather than running for the Senate. And Eastland would point out that Bilbo hadn't volunteered when he was of age. When he was 21 for the Spanish-American War, hadn't volunteered in World War I at that time when he was Eastland's age, so why should he? And he said, jump in the lake, essentially, in the 4-page letter I have for you in the appendix. That people say the Declaration of Independence is the greatest breakup letter there ever was. Well, Eastland and that letter to Bilbo is the number 2 in terms of breakup letters. But in the case of Stennis and Eastland, Eastland wanted to make sure that people in Mississippi, represented folks, didn't vote against each other, they didn't cut each other up, and so that both sides made a point to support each other. I think Brad Dye was one who said if you picked a fight with Stennis, you also picked a fight with Eastland, and Eastland fought harder if you got in his way than John Stennis did. Yeah.
You mentioned Jimmy Carter narrowly winning Mississippi in 1976.
Yeah.
Of course, the last time a mainstream Democrat won
Yeah.
the state of Mississippi in a presidential election. My father was a legislative assistant to Eastland in 1976 at that time.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I've always wondered is it arguable that, based on the research that I've done, Mississippi and Texas were the only 2 states that barely Carter barely carried. Is it arguable in the state of Mississippi that it was Eastland's support of Carter that helped him put him over again?
I think so. Who was your father, by the way?
Frank Barber.
Oh.
I got the big Jim Eastland up in here.
Okay. Your father, they speak very highly of. Woods Eastland once told me that he was the only one that they would allow to write a letter without editing it.
Wrote many letters for the man.
And his staff, one of the things about Eastland, people stayed. They didn't move off. Courtney Pace was 36. Your dad was on his staff for 20 years. And Bill Simpson, there's some wild tales I'd like to investigate about Bill Simpson.
I can tell you something. No.
No, one has to do with dynamiting of a plant ambulance before he got on the stand. But I'd like to chase down a little bit just for fun. But I think it did have a Eastland as Dennis certainly helped the Ford people sent Strom Thurmond down here to try and convince old line Southerners to become Republicans permanently, but Eastland instead stayed that off.
Carter barely carried in 76, and the last time, 1980, that was the last competitive because Reagan barely won. And that was the last time that it was a competitive election.
And you might see it competitive again.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think that was I think that support may have made a difference. I think that Carter was grateful to every part of that coalition. Just one story, another aide told me that Carter recognized how much he owed Mississippi. Tennessee Tom Bigby is appointed, but one of Carter's aides would ask for he wanted Eastland wanted to put one of his guys on the Farmers Home Administration Board, and he was getting a runaround. And so Eastland called Hamilton Jerb, I believe it was, and he said, can you put my friend on this board, or do I have to waste the president's time and ask him for this? About an hour later, the Secretary Bob Berglund of Agriculture at the time called and said, would you, Senator Eastland, would you let me read you the press release announcing Mark Hazard's appointment. So, yeah, but I would say that's a fair statement.
Maybe one more.
And just as a follow-up to the comment that the gentleman made in the back about the relationship between Eastland and African Americans. In Casey Marshall's book, Aaron Henry,
Yeah.
he indicates that that's more or less kind of a quid pro quo relationship than a friendship in terms of Aaron Henry getting something from Eastland, Eastland getting something from Aaron Henry. And that's how I view that relationship.
There's a lot to that, yeah, but I can add a couple of things that I don't think he would be one of the more intimate friends, but certainly there's a couple of things. In October of 1985, he sent $500 to the NAACP in Henry's honor, saying, here's a guy who helped show me the other side. And Hiram Eastland, the cousin, was the one white pallbearer in Aaron Henry's funeral. So there is something of a relationship there. Yeah, Hiram's very proud of that. Yeah. So quid pro quo, there's a lot to that.
Yeah.
But there's also a line that the two men come to trust each other. And maybe as politicians do. Maybe there's always one thing you keep an eye on. But I think that by 1977 and 78, Eastland did trust Aaron Henry.
We could go on, but let's see.